Okay, and we finally made it to this last piece of clothes, this bulky scarf that sits around the neck of the character. I left this one to the end because it requires a series of steps and techniques like the polygrouping and the UV mapping that we have been talking about, so it is a good opportunity to reinforce this workflow and to see these techniques applied in a different way. To start off, let's go ahead and select it and go into solo mode. And if you remember, we used the Ring 3D primitive to set up this piece, so we should have some nice loops that go around. Of course, there are some areas that are stretched, especially here at the back, but we'll fix that later. What I'll do first is create a polygroup for the top and another one for the bottom part. So we can use the select lasso with Ctrl and Shift to select it. And let's go ahead and click on an edge of a polyloop just to hide it. And by the way, only the lasso tool allows you to hide only a polyloop. And we also need to do the same thing for the inner part. And once we have those two loops hidden, we can go ahead and go to the polygroup subpalette, expand it, and let's go ahead and click on auto group. And we should now have 3 polygroups, 2 for the visible parts and the ones for the hidden loops that will keep the original polygroup. Alright, so we can now hide the bottom part, and let's go ahead and invert that selection. And let's make this a single polygroup just to unify the top area with the previously hidden loops under the same group ID. So all that was just so that we can have 2 polygroups with the nice clean separation in the middle. Now let's go ahead and open the series measure options under the geometry subpalette. And we're gonna enable this keep group switch. All right, and let's go ahead and run the series measure process. This should give you the resulting mesh of the series measure process, but with the polygroups intact. Okay, let's go ahead and select the slice curve. So let's click Ctrl Shift and select it from these options that we have here. And we'll use these to cut the sections in our mesh just to make it a little bit more interesting. I'm going to mask out half of the mesh so that we don't accidentally slice this part. And let's go ahead and start creating some cuts around the mesh. And remember to rotate around the view. And this is the same process we did when we extracted the wraps around the legs. And once you have the cuts ready, we can go ahead and invert the mask. So we'll do the same thing around the other side. Obviously in different places just to add a little bit of variation and asymmetry. And as you do this, try to avoid having polygroups that are too thin or sections that are too narrow between cuts. We want to keep the big chunky pieces of mesh. Okay, and once you're done with the slicing, let's go ahead and expand the edge loop options under the geometry subpalette. We just need to do a short setup for the settings. Let's go ahead and change the loops to only 2. The thickness is something that you can tweak to your liking. I'm just gonna go for a 0.04 value maybe. I'm gonna leave the polish slider as it is, but if you would like to produce rounder edges, you can increase this value as well. And finally, let's expand this bevel curve by clicking on this area. And let's go ahead and reset the curve from the reset button down here. And let's change the elevation as well to 0, just to avoid inflating shapes. Also make sure that the double switch is enabled and then click on panel loops. All right, now you should get something that looks similar to this. Basically, with those settings and by resetting the bevel curve, we end up with a series of thick plates that sort of follow the original volume of this mesh. Now we can move to the deformation palette, so let's go ahead and expand that. And we can use the polish slider to refine the sharp edges that were generated by the panel loop process, so they're a little bit rounder and softer. Okay, this still looks like some floating pieces, but before we address that, let's do another round of polishing because the panel loop process created separate IDs to the borders, and we want these borders to be part of the outer section and leave the inner section of this mesh as a separate ID, as a separate group ID. So with the selection tools, we can go ahead and click on the inner section to isolate it, and then go to the polygroup subpalette. Let's go ahead and expand that and hit the auto group button again. That should assign a different group or a different polygroup to each one of the loose visible pieces. Now we can invert the selection and do the same thing for the outer areas. Okay, and this looks pretty good. I'm going to quickly generate some UV maps from this mesh and making sure that the polygroup switch is enabled from the UV master plugin. And now let's click unwrap. Okay, perfect. This is what we wanted. Now to fix the gap problem between the parts, let's go ahead and move to the deformation palette again. And let's use the inflate slider to bring them all closer together. All right, something like that. And you might get some corners between some of the parts that look maybe too rounded. and that could be refined a little bit further. So you can use something like the move brush to adjust these bits. So here is a perfect opportunity to make use of the AccuCurve switch with the move brush, because you can pull a very pointy corner just to close these gaps between these 4 pieces of clothes. Or alternatively, you could use the pinch brush and bring all these 4 pieces closer together, and then do a pass with the inflate brush just to regain some of the volume lost with the pinching effect. Similar to what we did with the pieces of clothes wrapped around the arm, we can use the magic fold brush to create the initial setup for these compression folds all around the pieces and where the different parts meet as well. You could also use the X fold brush, the one that we use for the leg wraps, and just add a bit of compression folds, especially around where the different pieces of clothes meet. Obviously, the smooth brush and the smooth directional brush will be ideal to refine those volumes. The smaller details and tiny folds can also be achieved with a combination of the standard brush and the damp standard brush. But keep in mind that for this piece, we don't need so many details. The high frequency details and the tiny wrinkles or folds or maybe the pattern will be generated with a different process. So all we want here is to have an indication of what type of material this is and the main areas where the fabric is bending, producing the larger folds. Now, with all the folds and larger shapes in place, you can go back to the lowest subdivision level and use the move brush just to work on the placement and the volumes of the mesh, especially to refine any intersection with other pieces like the horns. Perfect. I feel that we're finally getting there. This is the last video of the sculpting section, but in the next series of videos, we're going to add more details and wrinkles and surface noise to really bring these odd spirits to life and to make it look really good in his clothes.